Hey everyone, PV here, and welcome to my new YouTube video. And in this week's video, we're going to do something similar to what we've already done before, and that is to get an interesting game from my MPL Split and talk about the thought process that led to each of the decisions that I took during that game. If you haven't seen it, this is something that I've already done a couple weeks ago. It was called Aggro Decks Are Hard to Play 2, and it was a video in which I went through a game against Kenyoku Hero. I was playing a Gruul deck in Historic, and then my idea was to show that even though these decks, this type of deck, isn't considered to be very hard, there are a lot of moments in which you have hard decision points that have a lot of consequence in the result of the match. So even decks that are considered, brainless by some people can be very hard to play as well. And today's video is about the same thing. I take a deck that is considered easy to play, that is Mono-White Aggro, and I go through a particularly hard game in which I believe there were a lot of interesting decisions that we can talk about. The game in question is Game 3 against Manuel de Pra, who's also playing a Mono-White Aggro deck, so a very similar deck to the one I'm playing. And I must warn you before we start that I made a lot of mistakes that game, so we're going to talk about the decisions that I made and why I made those decisions, but also what ideally I should have made. So while obviously that doesn't make me look great, making a ton of mistakes, it does make for a more interesting video and I believe for a good teaching experience. And this is what my deck looks like in the game that we're going to watch. It's a Game 3, so I'm already sideboarded. And Manuel is playing a White Winnie deck as well that's very similar to mine. It's not identical, he only has 2 Archons, for example, has more Halvars, and I don't know exactly how he sideboarded. I didn't have access to that information at the time of the match, but I imagine it's something relatively similar that he presented. So we're basically playing a mirror match here. Not an exact mirror match, but, well, pretty close. My hand Game 3 is quite good. I have the best 1-drop, I have the Alseid, I have my choice of 2 drops, and I have the Maul and the Archon for later in the game. And the Archon of Absolution in particular is probably the best card you can have in this matchup because it's just very hard to deal with and very impactful. It's not impossible to deal with because both players have the tech, the Scalding Cauldron, which is there basically only because it kills Archon because it's an artifact, so it ignores protection from White. It's the only reason that card is there to begin with. And both him and I have access to it, so the Archon doesn't run away with the game necessarily, but if it's not killed, it is very likely to win the game by itself. Sometimes if you have nothing else going on, you can also go over it. For example, if my hand was 6 planes and an Archon, then maybe if the Archon is the first play of the game, he can actually outgrow the Luminarchs and just go over it with the Haven and stuff. But given that I already have a lot of stuff to do and the Archon would be a curve topper in this hand, it's going to be very hard for him to win if he doesn't deal with it. So all I need to do is draw lands. I already have all the cards that I need to be able to win the game. I just need to be able to cast them. My first turn of the game is scripted. I'm just going to play my 1-drop. My opponent's going to play nothing. But then on turn 2, I'm already faced with my first decision, and that is whether I want to play the Luminarch Aspirant or Decision Hollowblade. And that is a decision that you'll be faced with many times if you play this deck. You're often put in this spot, and there's no clear answer for which one you want to play. Sometimes there is an answer, right? Sometimes there's one drop that is just better than the other 1-drop. So you just always play that if you have it. You have sort of a rank in your mind, and you just go through the rank until you find the highest one that you have in your hand, and you play that one. This is not the case for this deck. It's not the case for these 2 drops. It's very contextual. So it depends on whether your opponent can kill it or not, right? What is your opponent playing? Do you have a Selfless Savior to protect it? Where are you going to put the counter? Are you playing around removal? So what's happening here? And so there is not a formula that you can just follow that will tell you which one to play. You just have to deal with it in a case-by-case basis. In this case, I felt like one important thing was protecting my Luminarch, which is my best creature, from Glass Casket, right? And this is something that I can do because I have the Alseid in play if only I draw a land. So my idea was I'm not going to expose the Aspirant to the Casket before I can protect it. And obviously, if I don't draw a land, if I draw an expensive card, I'll probably have to play the Aspirant on turn 3 and deal with the consequences. But ideally, I want to give myself the opening of being able to protect it from Glass Casket on turn 3. So I attack, I play the Hollowblade after, and then my opponent plays his own Aspirant, and then I'm faced with another decision. And that decision is, do I want to play the Aspirant or not? Do I want to wait to protect it? And I think in this case, it's pretty clear I want to play it. Because if I draw a third land, I already have more plays, right? I drew another 3-drop, so I'm not going to be wanting to play Aspirant and protecting it the next turn. I'm going to tap out anyway, very likely. So I think it's pretty clear to play it. But the second decision is, what do I punt, right? Where do I put the counter? And that is another decision that you're gonna be facing yourself with every time when you play this deck, right? It's every turn you have a decision on where to put a counter. It is very rarely obvious. You have to think about what's going to happen in the game and what your priorities are. As a general rule, you don't want to put the counters on the creatures that sacrifice themselves, right? The Alseid and the Selfless Savior, because these creatures can just act as proxies for everything else. So there's no point in putting a counter on the Savior if you could put a counter on something else and then sacrifice the Savior to save that. So that is just a better sequence. So you very rarely just put the counters on these creatures. But in this case, if I put the counter on the Hollow Blade, I can only attack for 4, right? And I don't gain any life. Whereas if I put the counter on the Alseid, this actually allows me to attack with it. So it's a 2-point life gain that I get and 2-point damage that I deal. So it's a 4-point life swing that I'm getting by putting this counter on the Alseid instead of the Hollow Blade or the Luminarch itself. So I think the ability to just be able to attack with this extra creature, which both deals damage and gains me life, is more valuable than keeping this creature without a counter in it so that I don't lose out on the counter when I do eventually sacrifice it. So this is why I put counter on the Alseid here and not in any of the other 2 creatures. So on turn 3, my opponent plays Alseid, they play Scalding Cauldron, and they don't attack. They put the counter on the Aspirant and pass the turn. And here I have a choice, right? I'm never attacking with my Alseid, even if I pump it, right? Because it's going to become a 3-3, I'm going to attack, they're going to block and give Pro-Right to their Aspirant. So I'm going to be trading my 3-3 Alseid for their 1-1 Alseid, which is something that I really don't want to do. So I'm never attacking with it. But I could put a counter in it and leave it back to block, right? Because as a 3-3 blocker, it's a more impressive card than a 2-2 blocker. The problem is that it doesn't really do that much for me because they have the Luminarch that can just grow into a 4-4, can attack into it anyway if they want, right? So it's only stopping them from attacking with their Alseid, which it's kind of doing anyway. Furthermore, if I put a counter on the Alseid, then my Hollow Blade is going to remain at 3-1, and then my opponent can use the Scalding Cauldron to kill my Aspirant, at which point they'll grow their own Aspirant into a 4-4, and I will not be able to combat with it with the Hollow Blade. So right now, my Hollow Blade is always a step ahead of their Aspirant, right? I can put the counter on the Hollow Blade, it becomes a 4-power creature, I can attack with it, and they can never block, because it's always going to grow the same as their creature is growing. And even if they do kill the Aspirant with the Cauldron, then after the following turn I can still attack because I still have a counter ahead. Whereas if I don't put a counter here, if I put it on the Alseid, then all of a sudden my opponent is going to have a 4-4 creature and I have 2 3-power creatures that neither of them can attack. So I'll be really reliant on drawing that land to be able to deal with it. So overall, it felt better to me to just put the counter on the Hollow Blade for this variety of reasons. But again, this is a decision that you're always going to have to make individually, right? So there are a lot of things to consider each time you want to put a counter on something. And I don't know for sure that it was correct to pump the Hollow Blade and not to just pump the Alseid and have a bigger blocker. Now I have another decision to make, and that is, do I want to play my 1-drops, right? I can play the Giant Killer, I can play the Cauldron, I can play both, I can play neither. I think, not playing the Giant Killer can be somewhat appealing because my opponent has a 3-3 that is potentially going to grow into a 4-4. So having that chop down already is as protection from it might be appealing. But in this case, I think it's pretty clear to play the Giant Killer as a creature because it is a hedge on the fact that I might not draw a land. So if I do draw a land next turn, which would enable the chop down, I already have good plays to make. I'm already covered. So I can play the Maul, I can play the Apparition, both of which are going to be very good plays that will lead to a very good turn anyway. So I don't need this chop down to do something if I have a land. If I don't draw a land, however, then not playing the Giant Killer is going to be a very big cost because if the Giant Killer is in play, I can at least use that ability, right? So it is a much better situation if I don't draw a land, which is the nightmare scenario that I want to prevent. I want to make this scenario as good as possible. And it's almost irrelevant if I do draw a land because I have other stuff I want to play anyway. So I think in this scenario, it's pretty clear to play the Giant Killer, which is what I do. The second choice is not so clear to me, and that is playing the Scalding Cauldron or not. Because I have this Alseid, so this Alseid can protect my Hollow Blade or my Aspirant from Glass Casket and Skyclave Apparition. So if I don't play this Cauldron here, I keep a mana up. If I do play the Cauldron, I expose all my creatures to these removal spells. And this is what I did. I didn't play the Scalding Cauldron because I wanted to keep a mana up. But I think that was actually a big mistake for 2 reasons. The first one is that if they had any of these cards, I think they would be in play already. Right? If they had Glass Casket or Apparition, they would have played them last turn while I stepped out. Because I didn't have the mana to protect my creatures, and their turn was quite bad instead, right? They played a Cauldron that they're not even going to use right now in an Alseid. So it would have been much better I think, from their perspective, to just play their Apparition or play their Glass Casket. Right? There's a chance they didn't want to expose their Luminarch to a removal spell, like to my own Apparition or my own Glass Casket, right? And so they wanted to get that Alseid in play to be able to protect it. So there's a chance they still have these cards, but I think there's a likelihood that if they had either of these cards, they would have been in play already. So that's a sign that they don't have them. Not a guarantee, but it is evidence in that direction. And the second reason is that I assumed that not playing the Cauldron would not cost me much in the future, because the game was... I was slowing down the game anyway, right? I'm fine if the game gets bogged down. I'm fine if I have to take a turn off to, kill something and then play the Cauldron and then deal with their Archon. But I think that was just wrong. I think that was a misread of the situation on my part, because I think if they do play Archon and I do draw land, I want to immediately kill it, and I'm already able to attack with the Hollow Blade. So that is better than removing any other creature that they have. So in my mind, I thought, well, if they play the Archon, I'm going to be able to play the Apparition and get the Luminarch while they're tapped out anyway, so they can protect it. So I have a play already, even if they play the Archon, but I think killing the Archon with the Cauldron would just be a better play. On top of that, if I don't draw a land, I can at least now use the Giant Killer to tap something, and I'll still have the Cauldron in play, ready to use if I draw a land the future turn, right? Whereas if I don't draw a land and I don't play the Cauldron, then I can't use the Giant Killer next turn if I want to play the Cauldron, and I'll basically be in the same position next turn anyway. So I think it was a pretty big mistake on my part to not have played the Cauldron here. I think I didn't have to worry that much about protecting my creatures, and the mana was actually more meaningful than I calculated at that time in the game. Then, on the next turn, Mono-White puts a counter on his Alseid and attacks with his Aspirant. So he thinks for a long time before doing that, and then he attacks. And here I have two options that I believe are reasonable. First, I can take the damage, right? I don't care that much about my life total. I'll go from 23 to 20, big deal. The second option, however, is blocking the Luminarch with the Alseid and the Giant Killer, right? And this offers a trade. Let's then trade their Alseid and 1 mana for my Alseid, right? If they want to give you protection from white. Or they can use the Cauldron and 3 mana to kill my Giant Killer and then have the Alseid die to the Luminarch in combat. But that does eat their whole turn, most likely. So they do spend 3 mana and the Cauldron, right? I already know that the Cauldron is valuable because of the cards I have in my hand. So it's not a disaster if they don't get to use this Cauldron later on. If they use it now, it's something that I would want. But at the same time, it does feel like I'm committing too much to be able to get this trade, right? The Alseid is an important card that I have. And the Giant Killer is also important. So I'd be trading 2 important cards for this Scalding Cauldron and the turn, right? Which ultimately I didn't think was worth it. But it is very close. I think, you can see that I think for a while the video actually sped up. So that is a while that I think about things. I think about double blocking here because I do want to, slow the game down, and that does that. It does, basically spend his turn and takes out his answer. But ultimately, I decide that the cost for doing that is too big. So I just take the damage, and then he plays, Haven and Archon, which is the Nightmare scenario for me. So here, I don't draw a land. I draw yet another card that I can play. And you can start seeing the punishment for my play of not playing the Archon last turn, right? Because now not playing the Cauldron last turn. Because now I'll have to play the Cauldron because I want to be able to activate it in the next turn if I do draw a land. But playing it means that I can't use the Giant Killer. So I can't tap down anything, and otherwise I would be able to do that. So I actually lost out on a tapping because I didn't play that Cauldron the previous turn. And also, I have a decision of where to put the counter, right? I can put the counter on, realistically, I think any of my creatures. I felt they were all kind of expendable, right? The Luminarch is already obviously a good enough card by itself that it doesn't need the counter. It's already threatening as it is. And the Giant Killer I want to use to tap stuff, and the Alseid I want to use to sacrifice and protect from stuff. So this basically leaves the Hollow Blade, right? So I keep pumping it. And I believe there is merit to getting it to at least 5 power because it does threaten to kill them in 2 attacks if nothing else happens, right? So, for example, imagine they attack with their Archon. Next turn, I can attack with my Hollow Blade, and that will threaten to put them at 5 if they don't block, which means that the following turn I can give a protection from white and attack and actually kill them, right, with my Alseid. So I think putting the counter on the Hollow Blade is setting up for this sequence of plays potentially, and I have nowhere else to put the counters anyway. So I think this is not that complex of a play as it were the previous turns, but still an interesting decision to talk about. Here they put a counter on the outset, they attack, and they play a Sword of the Realm and pass the turn. So it means to me that they're likely going to use this Cauldron because they didn't equip the sword, right? They could have done that. So there's no reason for them to do it now. They just pass it on another 3-drop. And then I move to combat and they kill the Aspirant, right? So now I have a decision. Do I want to attack or do I want to not attack with my Hollow Blade? I decided to attack. And why did I attack? Because I felt like putting them on 5 life was an important milestone because it would mean that I'm threatening lethal the very next turn, right? Because how I envisioned this turn to go, I would attack, they would take the damage, go down to 5, and then they would attack with their Alseid in the hopes of gaining some life, and I'd be able to block with my own Alseid and sacrifice it to give protection to anybody, at which point they wouldn't gain any life because the creature wouldn't do any damage, my creature would not be in play anymore. So they would be at 5 life at the end of all that, and I would have a 5 power attacker, which would be threatening and would force them to react in ways they wouldn't want to. The problem with this line is that there's no way I actually have a 5 power attacker the very next turn, right? Well, I mean, I will have an attacker, but there's no way it's actually threatening lethal because they have that Archon in play. So even if I do draw a land, right, which means I can play them all and equip them all, I can't attack because I don't have a mana to pay for the Archon. And if I don't draw a land, or if I do and don't play them all, they can always block with the Aspirant or with the Haven. So it's impossible, unless they make a huge mistake, unless they just, animate Haven, attack with everybody, which I think is kind of unrealistic, right? To a player of this caliber to just put themselves dead on board. I think unless they make a huge mistake, there's no way they're actually threatened by being at 5 life. And it cost me a lot to make this play, right? It meant that I couldn't activate the Giant Killer, so and I had to lose my own Alseid as in the process to stop them from gaining life here. So I think this was a pretty big mistake on my part. It was a misevaluation of what the situation looked like because there's no way for me to actually break through this Archon. So this is exactly what happens, right? They move the sword, they attack with their creatures. I block and sack so they don't gain any life. So I have this lethal attacker that I wanted, but I actually can't attack, right? So I didn't accomplish anything. The very next turn, I finally draw my 3rd land, and I'm like, okay, so what do I do here? And this is, I think, a turn where I have a lot of different options, right? I could, for example, attack. Like, if I attack with the Hollow Blade, then they will have to block with something, right? Otherwise, it is lethal. And I get to kill one of their creatures for free, basically, because I'm going to discard a card that doesn't matter. But it does eat my entire turn because I have to pay a mana to attack, right? But I could just kill the Archon. If I kill the Archon and attack, then it doesn't eat my entire turn. But then they can just, for example, they can block with their Alseid, and they're going to gain a bunch of life and just return it to their hand. So it does lose out on the counters, but I also don't accomplish anything, right? Or they can even block with their Haven, right? So they lose the Haven, but they get to attack with the Alseid next turn and gain a bunch of life back, and then it might become pretty hard for me to win after that. So I decided that by drawing a land, this game would require a shift of approach. Because what I was doing before was trying to attack and get them dead, right? You see that my train of thought always included having lethal attackers, so I always put myself in a position where I wanted to kill them. But now that I drew a land, I decided that I did not need to kill them, that I could just, slow down, they have nothing else, and I'm just going to take this game slowly. I'm going to let them gain life, because I don't care about killing them anymore, or at least, just straight up killing them right now. So I don't need to go, land, apparition your Alseid, so that it's going to go back to your hand and then I can attack the next turn and you're not going to gain any life. It's not something that I ever have to do. And I don't have to attack here. I'm fine with them gaining life. And this is probably something that I should have realized earlier, right? I think I had too aggressive of a mindset from the get-go. And I just didn't need to have this aggressive mindset. So I should have realized that the long game was mine to lose. So what I needed to do was get to the long game. And which meant not attacking the previous turn and not attacking now. Luckily, I realized it now, right? It is better late than never, as they say. So it's not because I committed to a line of play that I have to commit to this line of play forever, right? This is not how it works. Yeah, I made a mistake the previous turn, but that doesn't mean I have to make a mistake now just to be consistent, right? I've learned from what happened, and I'm going to get a different approach at this point in time, which includes not dying and not caring about my opponent's life total at all. So you see here that I think for a very long time on what I'm going to do, and ultimately I just pass the turn. Here they decide to, I pass the turn and they decide to attack with their Archon and their Alseid. And I think this is a spot that's interesting because they're losing that Alseid, right? They're losing, the Alseid is going to come back, but they're losing out on 3 counters, right? What's happening is they're trading 3 counters off their Alseid and the equipment, which is not going to be on the Alseid anymore unless they pay 2 more mana, so it's going to cost them a little bit of mana to reset this Alseid to where it was, and it will be without the 3 counters in return for one of my cards in hand, right? So I'm going to discard a card and I'm going to kill that Alseid, but they are going to gain 6 life, which will put them outside of this lethal threshold, because at this point we're now in a spot where if I kill the Archon with the Cauldron, if I Cauldron down the Archon, I can actually play them all and attack, right? And that would actually be lethal. So it's a pretty heads up play by them. They have to attack here, otherwise they will die. And obviously he attacks and makes the correct play here. And yeah, I block and I give up. I have to give up one of my cards. Right, obviously it's not going to be the Archon. It can be Aluras or an Apparition. I think I choose to discard Aluras because I'm already constrained on mana anyway. I have so much to do with my mana, right, that I don't think I need this Lures to win if I do draw land. I think I need to plan for the scenario where I don't draw lands, because it means I can't play Archon, right? If I draw land, I just land the Archon and play. But if I don't draw lands, then what do I do? And I think playing Apparition Maul is more important than playing Aluras at this point. So I block, they gain a bunch of life. I'm not threatening lethal anymore. Their thing goes back to their hand, and then they just replay, right? I think that is all they do. They replay, re-equip, and pass. And here, I don't draw land, I draw an Aspirant, and I'm probably going to play an Apparition because I want to, empty the battlefield a little bit. But I make what might be the worst play of my career. Okay, definitely not a good play at all. And I play the Apparition and target their Luminarch Aspirant, which means that, obviously, they just sacrifice the Alseid and give you protection from white, and it goes back to their hand immediately, and I can't even attack. And I have no excuse for making this play. I just forgot that they could sacrifice their Alseid. And I promise you, I am not as horrible as this game is making me look like. I understand I'm making a lot of very bad mistakes. It's making me question making this video to begin with, because I don't want everyone to see these plays. But this was a case of thinking too much about the big picture and losing sight of the small picture. The small picture was they can just sacrifice the thing to give per white. Therefore, I'm never going to get rid of the Luminarch to begin with. I should obviously target the sword, right? But at this point, I was a little bit tilted. We're never drawing a land, but also excited that I might actually come back in this game, and everyone's watching, and it's tense. And I just forgot, right? I have no excuse. I forgot they could sack the Alseid to protect the thing, and you just would put back in their hand. So I finally, draw my 4th land. And now you'd think that I would just go and slam the Archon, right? It is the thing that I've been waiting for this entire time, but it's not actually what I do. And why don't I do that? Because I felt like if I just play the Archon, my opponent's sequence of plays would be to, put a counter on their Aspirant, make it a 6/6, sacrifice their Alseid, give it pro white, and attack, right? And I can't block because it's pro white, so I would take 6 damage going down to 8, and in 2 turns, they can just do the same. They'll have an 8/8, I will die. Right, so this is a pretty threatening sequence from them that I have to stop, right? So I think for a very long time, and I actually just play the Apparition and get rid of the sword, which is what I should have done the previous turn, right? So I think this was an unintuitive play, but I think correct in a spot like this, because obviously playing the Archon is very appealing, right? It's a card that's good on offense, on defense, it covers all my bases, but it doesn't address the issue at hand. And the issue at hand is that, they get rid of, they can give protection, attack past it 2 turns in a row, and then I'll die. Even if I have this Archon, there are 11. I can't push through enough damage to kill them before they can kill me. So I have to recognize that this is the bigger threat, and this is what I deal with. I play this Apparition and get rid of the sword, which again is what I should have done the turn before. Here they make an attack. They pump their Aspirant and attack with the Haven, the Aspirant, and the Hollow Blade. And the most important thing in this combat is that I don't take too much damage. Why? Because they have that Alseid, right? So they can sack the Alseid, give the Aspirant pro white. It's going to grow bigger than that, and it could just kill me with 1 hit. So say I take 6 damage here, right? Say I don't block that card now. I fall down to 8. in 2 turns I'm dead, and I'm guaranteed dead, right? Unless I can manage to keep up this Faceless Haven forever, right? Which is not a super realistic thing, right? It's going to be very hard for me to win if I have to keep up this mana for the remainder of the game. So I have to not take this Aspirant to the face, basically. And I also can't just double block the Aspirant and take 7 damage, right? This is not going to work out for me. So I have 2 choices, I think. I can block the Faceless Haven with the Hollow Blade, which will kill the Faceless Haven, and then chump the Aspirant. Or I can double block the Aspirant with the Hollow Blade and the Giant Killer, and chump the Faceless Haven, right? These are my 2 choices. And then in this scenario where I double block, my opponent loses their Alseid, so they lose this big threat, and I lose my Giant Killer, but they don't lose their Haven, right? So I felt like it was better to just stop the Haven from being a nuisance in the future. So I just blocked the Haven, I kept my Giant Killer, because I'm now at a point where I'm starting to, have mana that I can use. So I decided to do that, but I'm not sure that it was right. Honestly, I think it's a pretty complicated situation. It is possible that double blocking and getting rid of that Alseid at the cost of the Giant Killer and not getting rid of the Haven is a better play. So the question is the Alseid worth more than the Giant Killer and the Haven, right? This is basically the exchange that I'm making, either the Giant Killer and the Haven or the Alseid. And normally the answer would be obviously not. Obviously the other 2 cards are worth more. But in this particular situation where I have the superiority in cards and I just don't want to die, right? I think it's possible that the Alseid is worth more, but I decided that it wasn't in the end. I think that's correct. If I had to make the same decision, I would make the same decision again. I would just kill the Faceless Haven and not lose my Giant Killer. But I do think it's a close play that is still worth thinking about. So I block here, as described. I discard my worst card, the Luminarch, and they pass the turn, right? So nothing else happens. And then I draw an Alseid here, and I have to decide what to do, right? I'm certainly going to play the Archon this turn. I think this is the best play that I can make. But I have a choice as to whether I attack with, basically all of my creatures. I think you could justify attacking with any number of my creatures, right? So I could attack with nothing, with 1, with 2, with 3, and with any combination of them, basically. So I have to think about this a little bit during the game because, again, it's not as clear as it seems. My first priority here is making sure I'm presenting lethal damage next turn, right? I want to have the potential ability to kill my opponent. And how much damage do I have next turn? Well, I have 3 from the Archon, that's unblockable, and 7 from the Hollow Blade with the Maul. So I'm dealing a potential 10 damage next turn that is currently unblockable, at least as far as the game state goes. So I want to make sure I do at least 1 point of damage to my opponent, because this will just present this lethal threat. If I don't deal 1 point of damage here, if I don't attack with anything, then they will be 11, I won't be able to kill them. So the first thing is that I have to attack with something, but I could attack with more things. If I attack with the Apparition, then they'll go to 9, they'll probably not block, right? I think I have to assume they won't block, it would be a very weird block. They'll go to 9, and I'll have this lethal threat next turn, so that works. But I could also attack with the Hollow Blade. If I attack with the Hollow Blade in the Apparition and they don't block, then they'll take 5 more damage, they'll go down to 4. Which means that the Archon itself is not enough to deal lethal damage, because the Archon is only 3, I can't equip it, it's per white. So I have to commit another attacker anyway, but I get an attacker that does not die to Giant Killer. So if I play them all and I equip my own Giant Killer, that is enough to kill my opponent. So I think that is the main consideration for attacking with the Hollow Blade as well, right? It's achieving this lethal threshold without being vulnerable to Giant Killer at all, which I think is a pretty valuable thing. And will that expose me to something, right? What happens if I attack with the Hollow Blade and the Apparition, and they play a Maul and kill my Archon and then attack me with everything? Do I die? No, right? Because I still have the Giant Killer, even though they do have lethal damage there. They will have 11 damage because the Aspirant will pump something. I will still survive this exchange because I can chump block with the Giant Killer, and then next turn I can kill them anyway, right? So I think this is probably what I should have done. I should have attacked with the Hollow Blade and the Apparition and played the Archon, because this would allow me to kill them without being vulnerable to Giant Killer the very next turn. But I decided not to do that. I decided to play it safe. I was worried about something happening. They're killing my Archon, and then maybe even having something else to kill my Giant Killer and then attack and kill me. But I think if they had anything like that, they would have played it already, right? So it's pretty I think, pretty clear to me that they can't have something like, they can't have a Glass Casket, they can't have an Apparition, because those would just be in play already, right? So, and I think the Cauldron would also have been in play at this point. So they have to draw 2 cards this turn, which is not going to happen for this play to punish me. So I think I should have attacked with the Hollow Blade here. That was another mistake on my part. So here I am, I attack with the Apparition, I play the Archon, and I pass. And then they put their counter on, they think for a while, put their counter on the Luminarch, and pass the turn. It makes sense to put the counter on the Luminarch. There's no point in diversifying your counters right now. They're just trying to set up potentially, you know, a one-hit kill with this Pro-White. So there's no point in diversifying here. Then I draw a land, and my turn is quite interesting. And why is my turn interesting? Well, I have the ability to go for the kill here, right? If I play Maul of the Skyclaves, equip the Hollow Blade, I can attack for 10 damage in the air, and there are 9. So this is the play that we set up the previous turn that, you know, actually gas them dead if they don't have anything. And how can they live through this scenario? They can have Giant Killer, right? Because if they have Giant Killer, I can either discard a card to make my creature indestructible, at which point I won't be able to attack because it taps, or I can play the Alcid, sacrifice the Alcid, give you Pro-White, but the Maul will fall off. So I won't have this extra 2 damage, I'll only be dealing 8 damage in this spot. Right, which is why I believe I should have attacked the previous turn, because then the Giant Killer is lethal with the Maul, and that is something that they can't Giant Killer themselves, so that will leave them with no outs if I had attacked. But I didn't, so we have to work with what we have. And what is the downside of trying to go for the kill? What happens if they did draw that Giant Killer this turn? At first glance, I would say it looks safe to go for the kill, because there's no way for them to interact with it after I get to declare attackers. So if I play them all, equip, and I go to attacks, they have to chop down immediately, because if they don't, my creature will already be attacking, I can give it indestructible, it will tap, but it won't matter. So they have to chop down pre-combat, which means I just don't attack with the Archon, right? Because the Archon isn't lethal by itself anymore, and I'll have lethal anyway, so attacking next turn anyway. So attacking doesn't accomplish anything. So this leaves me in a spot where there's almost no way that I die if I go for the kill, which makes it look perfectly safe. But there is one way that I die, and that way is them drawing another Alcid of Life's Bounty, because they have currently 10 power in play outside of the Alcid. They have a 7/7 and a 3/1, but the Luminarch will put a counter on something, which will give them 11 power. I'm at exactly 11 life, so they'll have 11 power split over 2 creatures, and if we can give them both Pro-White, this will kill me no matter, regardless of whether I leave the Archon back or not. So is there a way I can stop this from happening? Yes, there actually is. I have a Faceless Haven. Faceless Haven is a colorless blocker. So even if they have the Alcid, they can give protection to white for both their creatures and attack, but I have this Haven to block. Of course, it won't work if they have the Giant Killer, right? If I don't make them use the Giant Killer, they can just Giant Killer my Faceless Haven. The issue is that this costs a lot of mana, right? I have the Archon in play. So how much mana do they need? Let's assume they need, 1 to play the other Alcid, 2 to activate both Alcids, 2 to attack with both creatures, and 3 more for the chop down. So they need 8 mana, they currently have 7. So I can play around everything except for land, Giant Killer, and Alcid as the 2 cards they have in hand, and the extra card they drew. So here there are basically 2 scenarios, 2 different things for me to play around. If I play them all and try to go for the kill, I lose to exactly Giant Killer in hand, and then second Alcid either in hand or on top of their library. If I don't go for the kill, if I just attack with the Archon, which means I set up the kill next turn anyway, right? Because I have this Giant and the Maul, so that's 6 damage. So I'm setting up the kill anyway next turn. If I don't go for it, I'm going to lose to a combination of Giant Killer plus Alcid plus land, but it can be in any order, right? So it doesn't matter which one of the cards is on top of their library, that will also work for them. So we have to figure out what is more likely. If their cards in hand right now are Giant Killer land, it's the same, right? Because the Alcid from the top will kill me regardless, and not an Alcid from the top will never kill me. So this situation we can completely ignore. If their cards in hand are Giant Killer plus Alcid, then it matters. Because if I go for the kill, I'm dead anyway. If I don't go for the kill, I only die if their top card is a land. So that scenario favors not going for the kill. If their cards in hand are land and Alcid, then it also matters. Because going for the kill now, I stop their chance of drawing Giant Killer to kill me. Right? I just kill them immediately. Whereas if I don't go for the kill, they can have Giant Killer on top and then kill me. So that's another relevant situation. And finally, they can have a hand that, is not 2 of these 3 cards. They can have something else. They can have, a Seasoned Hollow Blade somewhere in there. in which case it would favor not going for the kill, because not going for the kill only loses to this exact combination of cards, right? They need all 3 cards to be the exact 3 things, whereas going for the kill just requires 2 cards. It requires a Giant Killer in hand and an Outseed somewhere. So going for the kill means their second card can be anything and it's fine, whereas not going for the kill means it has to be exactly that for me to get punished. The issue with that is that if they had any other card that is not one of these 3 cards, I think they would have played them. I think if they had, a Glass Casket or a Skyclave Apparition or a Hollow Blade or, any other creature, basically, this would just, another Luminarch, this would just be in play, right? So the only cards they would not have played are Land, because it doesn't do anything and they already played the Land, or Giant Killer, because they don't need to play it, they can wait for me to attack, or Outseed, because there's no point in showing me that this is what they have, right? If they have an Outseed in hand, they would want to hold it, I think. They would want to keep that card a secret to kill me, out of nowhere. Because if they play it, it's going to be obvious to me that they have lethal damage, right? That I'll have to try to kill them. Whereas if they don't play it, I could not be aware of this possibility. I could not even consider the fact that I could die. So they have 2 cards in hand, but they can only really be Giant Killers, Lands, or Outseeds, right? I don't believe they can realistically be anything else. So after all of this, what is my conclusion? Well, my conclusion is that I should probably go for it, because it is very likely that one of their cards at least is a land, right? From the way the games have played out, it's unlikely they're holding both Outseed and Giant Killer for this many turns, right? So I think it is likely that it's a land. Also, they played a land last turn, right? So it makes it more likely that they have a land in hand because they have this Hollow Blade that they might want to save. So I think, I would bet that one of their cards is a land. Obviously, I can't know for sure, but I think it's a strong possibility. And if one of their cards is a land, going for it is just better, because it plays around the scenario where the second card is Outseed and the top card is Giant Killer. So if one of the cards is a land, then I only lose in a scenario where the other 2 cards are Giant Killer and Outseed, right? But by going for it, I only lose if the Giant Killer is in hand and the Outseed on top. Whereas by waiting, I lose in the other scenario as well. I lose if their hand is Outseed, and I lose if their hand is Giant Killer, right? Assuming the other card is on top. So I think this just gives me more odds. There are more things that I play around by going for it immediately. The counterpoint is that if their hand is exactly Outseed and Giant Killer, and their top card is not a land, then the other scenario gains, right? Then I win the game in the other scenario, and I don't win the game, I lose the game in the first scenario where I go for it. But I think their card being a land is so much more likely that going for it is the percentage play. Except, this was not what I actually did. What I did was just attack with the Archon and play it safe, which I think was the anti-percentage play. But honestly, it's hard to blame myself for this particular mistake because I just didn't have enough time during the match, right? I've been talking about this sequence for, 5-10 minutes, and I don't have 5-10 minutes during the match, right? It's only post-analysis, post-match that can do this analysis and really identify every single scenario that is possible and try to play around it, right? And decide what is the best thing to play around. During the match, I identified some of the things which made it likely to me that not going for it was the best play, right? I thought the Giant Killer was the card that we're most likely to have in hand other than the Outseed. I didn't consider that much that they would hold the Outseed if they had it, which led to making the play that I did. But I think, in hindsight, with all the information and all the time in the world to think about it, I think my play was probably incorrect. But it turned out that my opponent didn't really have anything relevant, right? They just did something random. They played the Apparition, which didn't really matter. I kept them all in the Outseed, and they didn't really have a good attack either. So here I tap their Luminarch, and I know that the moment they pass the turn that I have won the game, because I know that there is nothing that they can do to stop me from attacking with 2-3 Power Flyers. Right? The only instant speed interaction in this deck is Giant Killer, and this is something that I know because we have open deck lists, so I know that at this point, all I have to do is equip them all to one of my 1-power creatures, which leaves it immune to Giant Killer, right? The only way for me to lose this game is to equip the Apparition instead, which could be a disaster. So yeah, this was a pretty interesting game, I thought. I was very frustrated at times because I didn't draw a third land, and I felt that it was all I needed. And because I didn't draw that land, I kind of got frustrated and didn't think as much in some moments that I had to think about, and I made some mistakes, which led to more frustration, and it kind of spirals and snowballs into making more and more mistakes. But I still think it was a very interesting match because there were a lot of moments in which it didn't look like I had a decision to make, but I actually did. So there were deceptively important moments, there were pivotal moments that didn't look like pivotal moments. So I think this is something that happens a lot when you play this kind of deck, right? You are making a decision that is going to define the outcome of the match, but it doesn't look like it when the decision is being made, which is why I think it's interesting to go back and analyze this particular type of game. So yeah, if you like this video and want to support my work a little bit more, make sure to check out my Patreon page. It's patreon.com/PVDDR. And special thank you to my biggest supporters, Geoffrey Whitehead, Jamie Gonzalez, Mattia Giardini, Thomas Pocorni, and Lawson. I really appreciate this support, and I'll see you next week.